Holy Spirit, teach me to listen to God's heavenly directions. You still believe in God, but listening to Him feels harder than it used to. Not because you stop praying, but because you are tired of guessing. Tired of wondering whether a thought is faith or fear, whether a desire is obedience or impulse. You want to follow God, but you do not want to confuse your own voice with His. That tension is not rebellion. It is hunger for truth. Many people lose confidence in listening to God, not because God stopped speaking, but because they were taught to listen with pressure. Pressure to feel something dramatic. Pressure to interpret every emotion. Pressure to act fast so they do not miss God. Over time, that pressure creates noise, and noise makes listening exhausting. This moment is not about learning a new spiritual technique. It is about slowing down enough to relearn posture. Listening to God has always been relational before it was directional. Heaven does not rush the heart. The Holy Spirit does not compete with anxiety. God does not whisper to confuse you. He speaks to align you. If you stay here, you will not be asked to strain your mind or chase signs. You will be guided into a calmer, truer way of listening, one that brings clarity without forcing answers. And it begins by understanding a distinction that changes everything. The difference between hearing God and trying to interpret Him. The difference between hearing God and trying to interpret Him. Most people do not struggle to hear God because He is silent. They struggle because they try to interpret everything at the same time. Every feeling becomes a question. Every thought becomes a test. Every decision carries the pressure of getting it exactly right. That pressure does not sharpen listening. It distorts it. Hearing God is receptive. Interpreting God is defensive. When you are hearing, your heart is open. When you are interpreting, your mind is tense. The Holy Spirit speaks to a heart at rest, not to a mind in panic. Interpretation driven by fear creates noise, and noise drowns direction. Many confuse discernment with constant analysis. They think listening means decoding emotions, assigning meaning to every impression, and rushing to conclusions. But God does not require you to decode Him. He requires you to trust Him. Listening begins when you stop trying to control what you hear. There is a reason Jesus often spoke in ways that required stillness, not because He wanted confusion, but because hurried hearts mishear truth. The Spirit of God does not compete with urgency. When urgency dominates, interpretation replaces listening, and interpretation without peace always leads to exhaustion. Hearing God does not begin with clarity. It begins with consent. Consent to slow down. Consent to not label every thought. Consent to let God lead the pace of understanding. This is where many miss direction. They listen with tension instead of trust. When you release the need to interpret everything immediately, something shifts. Your inner posture changes. The heart becomes quieter. The pressure eases, and in that quiet direction becomes more recognizable, not louder, but clearer. This is why learning to listen is less about gaining information and more about releasing interference. And as that interference settles, another truth becomes evident. God often speaks in ways that calm the heart, not impress the senses. That is where true listening deepens. Why God often speaks in ways that calm, not impress. If you expect God's voice to overwhelm you, surprise you, or shake you emotionally, you may miss it when it comes quietly. Heaven does not need to impress to be authoritative. The Holy Spirit is not competing for your attention. He is restoring your stability. That is why God often speaks in ways that calm the heart instead of exciting the senses. Many people associate God's guidance with intensity, strong emotions, sudden certainty, immediate clarity. But intensity is not the same as truth. Emotional impact can come from many sources, including fear, desire, and pressure. The voice of God carries a different signature. It settles you, it steadies you. Even when it challenges you, it does not destabilize you. God knows that an impressed heart is not the same as an aligned heart. What impresses you may move you quickly, but what calms you keeps you faithful. The Holy Spirit prioritizes what will sustain you over time, not what will thrill you in the moment. That is why His direction often feels simple, grounded, and quietly firm. When God speaks, urgency decreases. Panic loses volume. You may still feel uncertainty, but it no longer controls you. This calm is not passivity. It is clarity without pressure. It allows you to remain present instead of reactive. That is how you recognize that direction is coming from heaven and not from emotional momentum. If you only trust guidance that feels dramatic, you will overlook guidance that is consistent. God's voice is recognizable not by how loud it feels, but by how safe it makes your inner world. Safety creates space for obedience. Pressure creates resistance. As you learn to value calm over intensity, you begin to notice something else. Many times God's direction feels distant, not because He is silent, but because the heart is crowded. And that leads to the next step in learning to listen. Understanding the inner noise that competes with heavenly direction. The inner noise that competes with heavenly direction. God's direction rarely disappears. What usually happens is that it gets covered by noise. Not external noise, but the inner kind that builds quietly when the heart is overloaded. Fear of making the wrong choice, pressure to decide quickly, the weight of expectations, comparisons, unfinished conversations, unresolved emotions. All of that fills the inner space where listening should happen. The Holy Spirit does not raise His voice to overpower this noise. He waits for room, not because He is passive, but because God respects the pace of the heart. When the inside is crowded, even truth feels distant. Not because God moved away, but because attention is divided. Inner noise often disguises itself as responsibility. You tell yourself you must think more, analyze more, pray harder, consider every scenario. But the more you force clarity, the louder the noise becomes. Listening to God was never meant to feel like mental strain. Strain is a signal that something else is driving the process. Fear is one of the loudest competitors. Not obvious fear, but subtle fear. Fear of missing God. Fear of disappointing Him. Fear of wasting time. That fear creates urgency, and urgency compresses the heart. A compressed heart cannot listen well. It reacts, anticipates, and assumes. Another source of noise is emotional residue. Feelings you never had space to process continue speaking in the background. Disappointment, grief, frustration, unmet expectations. They do not make you unspiritual. They make you human. But if they are ignored, they influence how you interpret God's voice. The Holy Spirit does not begin by correcting your decisions. He begins by quieting the heart. Not by removing emotions, but by ordering them. When the noise settles, direction does not suddenly appear. It becomes recognizable, familiar, gentle, firm. This is why learning to listen to God often starts with clearing space, not seeking answers. And once that space opens, something unexpected happens. You begin to sense direction, even before you fully understand it. That is where listening matures into alignment. Learning to recognize direction before understanding it. God often guides you before He explains Himself. That can feel uncomfortable, especially if you are used to clarity coming first. But heaven does not train the heart through full explanations. It trains it through alignment. You begin to sense where to stand before you know exactly where the path will lead. This is one of the clearest shifts in spiritual maturity. You stop waiting to understand everything before moving, and you start noticing when something inside aligns quietly. No excitement, no pressure, just a settled sense that a certain posture, decision, or restraint is right. That sense is not emotional certainty. It is directional peace. The Holy Spirit often adjusts your inner posture before giving instruction. You feel drawn to slow down, to wait, to stop forcing an outcome. You may not know why yet, but resisting that adjustment creates unrest. Honoring it brings calm. That calm is not the destination. It is confirmation that you are aligned. God knows that if he explained everything first, the mind would try to control the process. So he teaches the heart to recognize direction through relationship, not information. Direction becomes something you live into, not something you solve. When you learn to recognize direction before understanding it, trust deepens. You stop demanding clarity as proof of guidance. You begin to see alignment as evidence that God is already leading. And that prepares you for a truth that reshapes listening even more deeply. Obedience sharpens hearing far more than effort ever could. How obedience sharpens listening more than effort does. There is a moment when you realize that trying harder to hear God is not what improves listening. Responding does. Spiritual hearing does not grow through mental strain, longer analysis, or stronger effort. It grows through faithfulness to what is already clear. Obedience sharpens listening because it trains the heart to recognize God's tone, not just his words. Many people want more direction when what they actually need is to honor the direction they have already sensed. The Holy Spirit often speaks softly, then waits. Not to test you, but to build trust. When you respond to what you know, even in small ways, your inner awareness becomes more sensitive. Listening becomes relational, not mechanical. Effort focuses on control. Obedience focuses on trust. Effort asks, am I hearing correctly? Obedience says, I will respond faithfully and stay teachable. God does not require perfect accuracy before movement. He requires a willing heart that stays aligned while moving. When you obey, even without full clarity, something changes inside you. The fear of mishearing loses power. The pressure to get everything right eases. You begin to recognize God's direction, not because it is louder, but because your heart is more familiar with his presence. This is why obedience often precedes deeper clarity. God guides responsive hearts more than anxious ones, and as obedience becomes your posture, another sign becomes evident. God's direction begins to contradict urgency while strengthening peace. When God's direction contradicts urgency but strengthens peace, one of the most reliable markers of God's guidance is that it resists panic. Heaven does not rush the heart. Urgency often feels spiritual because it feels important, but importance and pressure are not the same thing. When God is leading, movement may still be required, but panic is removed from the process. Urgency demands immediate action to relieve discomfort. God's direction invites steady obedience that strengthens peace, even when the decision is serious. You may feel the weight of responsibility, but not the chaos of fear. That difference matters. Pressure narrows vision. Peace widens discernment. The Holy Spirit does not motivate through threat. He does not say, act now or lose everything. That voice does not come from heaven. God's guidance creates firmness without force. You feel compelled but not pushed, directed but not cornered. When urgency drives a decision, the heart contracts. When God guides, the heart stays open. You may still feel tension, but you remain internally stable. That stability allows you to choose with clarity instead of reacting to fear. Many miss God's direction because they confuse intensity with truth. But the Spirit's voice carries authority without agitation. When peace grows while urgency fades, you are not losing momentum. You are gaining alignment. This is how God protects you from decisions that feel spiritual but are driven by anxiety. And once urgency loosens its grip, you become capable of something essential: waiting without disconnecting. The role of waiting without disconnecting. Waiting becomes dangerous only when it turns into disengagement. God never asks you to pause your heart, only your haste. When the Holy Spirit invites waiting, He is not withholding direction. He's refining your ability to stay present without forcing movement. Many people associate waiting with inactivity, silence, or being left behind. But waiting in God is active alignment. It is staying attentive without demanding speed. It is remaining open without chasing clarity. The heart stays connected even when the path stays quiet. Disconnection happens when waiting feels like abandonment. Alignment happens when waiting feels intentional. The difference is posture. When you wait with God, your sensitivity increases. When you wait without Him, doubt takes over. The Holy Spirit teaches you to remain inwardly responsive while outwardly still. This kind of waiting protects you from false momentum. It prevents you from acting just to escape uncertainty. While you wait, God is not idle. He is stabilizing your inner world so that when direction comes, it does not overwhelm you. Waiting without disconnecting also trains trust. You learn that silence does not mean absence. You learn that clarity grows in hearts that remain faithful even when answers are delayed. And as you learn this, another truth becomes clear. God confirms direction without overwhelming the heart. How God confirms direction without overwhelming the heart. God does not confirm His direction by flooding your emotions or overwhelming your senses. He confirms it by coherence, by repetition that feels steady, not urgent, by alignment that strengthens over time instead of fading. When direction comes from heaven, it settles into your life without creating chaos. Confirmation from God rarely arrives all at once. It appears through consistency, the same conviction returning quietly, the same clarity holding firm across different moments, the same peace remaining even when circumstances shift. This kind of confirmation does not excite the flesh, but it reassures the heart. Many people miss confirmation because they expect intensity. They wait for a feeling that overwhelms them or a moment that removes all doubt. But God values maturity over drama. He confirms direction in ways that allow you to remain grounded, present, and free to choose without pressure. The Holy Spirit confirms direction without bypassing your responsibility. He does not decide for you. He walks with you. Confirmation strengthens your confidence, not your dependence. You find yourself less anxious about being wrong and more attentive to staying aligned. When confirmation is from God, it does not contradict what He has already been shaping in you. It fits. It makes sense internally, even if it stretches you externally. That internal coherence is a powerful sign that heaven is guiding your steps. As this kind of confirmation becomes familiar, listening changes again. You stop asking, "Is this God?" every time something moves inside you. You begin to recognize His tone, His timing, His steadiness. Listening becomes relational, and when listening becomes relational, it no longer feels like a skill you must master. It becomes something you rest into. That is where this journey leads, not to perfect hearing, but to a trusted relationship with the one who guides you. When listening becomes a relationship, not a technique, there is a moment when listening to God stops feeling like a task you need to perform and starts feeling like a relationship you can rest in. You no longer measure your faith by how clearly you hear instructions. You measure it by how deeply you trust the one who is guiding you. That shift changes everything. At this point, you are no longer anxious about missing God. You are more concerned with staying close to Him. Listening becomes less about extracting information and more about remaining aligned. You stop asking, "Am I hearing correctly?" and begin asking, "Am I walking with Him?" That question carries peace instead of pressure. God never intended listening to be mechanical. He never asked you to master a method or perfect a skill. He invited you into communion. The Holy Spirit teaches you over time through presence, not performance. Through relationship, not strain. And in relationship, trust replaces fear. When listening becomes relational, silence no longer threatens you. Waiting no longer frustrates you. Uncertainty no longer paralyzes you. You understand that God is not distant when He is quiet. He is near, forming you, steadying you, preparing you to walk without anxiety. You begin to recognize that God's heavenly directions are not always about where to go next. Often they are about how to walk now, with humility, with attentiveness, with peace. And when that posture is established, direction flows naturally. By the end of this journey, you are not left with all the answers. You are left with something more enduring: confidence without arrogance, peace without passivity, trust without blindness. You know that God knows how to guide you, and you know how to stay available to His leading. You are no longer trying to listen perfectly. You are learning to stay close. And when closeness becomes the goal, direction follows.